You've felt it, but you've never known what to say. Not sadness, not fear, not even longing, just a flicker, a pulse behind your thoughts. The feeling that comes when no one is speaking, but everything sounds too loud. It's there when you smile for no reason and don't know why it makes you want to weep. It's there in quiet places where nothing is wrong, and still something hurts. You've held it for years. This unnameable feeling, that doesn't belong to words, only to you. And perhaps it never needed a name, only your attention, only your breath, only this moment to finally say, I know you're here. There is a feeling. It does not arrive in full color. It doesn't knock. It doesn't scream. It lingers at the edge of sensation, just loud enough to be noticed, but too soft to be described. It slips between the folds of more popular feelings, between fear and awe, between longing and shame, between a memory that isn't yours and a future that feels familiar. It moves like fog in a locked room. It's what you feel when you forget what you were trying to remember, but still feel the weight of its absence. It lives in the pause. After someone asks, "Are you okay?" and you almost say yes, but something inside hesitates. Not because you're lying, but because something unnamed has taken up residence inside your answer. Some say it feels like waiting. Others say it feels like being seen by something with no eyes. You've known it since childhood, when you first looked at the sky and realized it was far too big for your body to understand. It showed up again the moment you recognized your reflection and thought, that can't be all I am. It hums beneath your smiles. It echoes inside your confidence. It's there when you laugh too loudly at something you don't find funny, and when silence feels like a verdict instead of a pause. It is not sadness. It is not peace. It is not confusion. And yet it borrows colors from all three. Sometimes it feels like the ache before crying, but without the tears. Other times it's the calm that follows despair. Not relief, but resignation wrapped in soft fabric. You have no word for it. None of us do, but it visits everyone. Some mistake it for mood. Others call it a ghost. Some try to bury it under schedules and screens, but it grows in the shadows, like moss on thoughts that never found air. It does not shout. It does not fade. It simply waits, patient, uninvited, and whole, for the moment when your language breaks down and you are forced to feel. Without naming, that's when it emerges fully and without apology. It arrives in quiet tides, a swelling beneath perception. You do not summon it. It arrives unaccompanied, like music from a room you didn't know had a door. It often comes during transitions between one thought and the next, between the last word of a conversation and the moment you close the door. You might find it staring at your own hands and not remembering how they became yours. You might hear it in the second syllable of your name, as if it suddenly sounded foreign. It drapes itself over nostalgia, but is not nostalgic. It wears the scent of memory, but doesn't belong to any one event. You might feel it while folding laundry or passing a stranger who reminds you of someone who never existed. It's the reason you sometimes cry when nothing is wrong, and the reason you sometimes feel empty in moments that should be full. Psychology has no diagnosis for it. Philosophy stares at it and shrugs. Language, the great container of meaning, spills it every time it tries to hold it, because this is not an emotion you feel. It is one that feels you. It tests your edges to see if you will collapse inward or expand outward. It's what you're left with after love has gone, but before grief begins. It's the flicker that lives between understanding and surrender. And yet it is not a void, it is presence. In its most untranslatable form, it reminds you that you are still a body, still a breath, still a witness to something unnamed, and therefore sacred. And maybe that's why it never took on a title, because names are cages, and this feeling was never meant to be tamed. It was meant to arrive quietly, to sit beside you and teach you how to feel without needing to explain. And in that silence, in that sacred wordless ache, you are finally real. It's possible this feeling is older than language, older than thought, something primordial, a residue left behind by the first thing to ever feel alone. It does not belong to you, but it passes through you, a visitor without face or form, carving hallways in the mind. Where light cannot reach, you try to share it, with friends, with lovers, in metaphors and unfinished poems, but the words always collapse just before they touch it. So you turn instead to rituals, to pacing, to staring at ceilings, to rereading old messages, hoping to find the moment. You forgot how to be understood. You've even looked for it in dreams. That place where meaning breaks and reforms in symbolic fragments, but there too it stays just out of reach. Sometimes you pretend it's gone. You distract yourself. You become efficient. You clean things. You speak louder. You walk faster. You collect affirmations, like charms against the unspeakable. But in the stillness, always it returns, not to haunt you, but to ask you something, to ask if you remember what it was like before you knew how to describe pain, before you divided yourself into categories, before the self was fragmented by opinions and outcomes. It does not want to be solved, it wants to be witnessed. And if you can sit beside it without demanding clarity, if you can feel it without fleeing, you may begin to remember that not all things must be named to be known. Some feelings are temples made of silence. And this one waits for you at the threshold. Always has, not with answers, but with the honesty of presence. There are tears you never shed, not because they don't want to fall, but because they know they will not be understood when they land. This chapter is not about sadness, it's about the silence around it. Not the absence of words, but the failure of words. To carry what you mean, you always try, to be legible, to be clear, to put shape to the storm with syllables. But something dissolves between your intent and their interpretation. You say, "I'm tired." They hear, "I need rest." But what you meant was, "I have been carrying a version of myself I do not believe in anymore." You say, "I'm fine." They smile and move on. But what you meant was, "Please ask again. I'm drowning too neatly." There is a language beneath the language. It is coded in glances, pauses, breath. It hides behind inflections and cracks in tone. It's fluent in trembling. But most people aren't listening. Most people listen for sense, but not for sensation. They don't hear the parentheses in your voice, the afterthoughts you bury. They don't hear the version of you screaming between commas. So you learn to speak in approximation, to dress your inner chaos in digestible metaphors, to edit out the parts of your truth that would only make others uncomfortable. You build bridges out of incomplete sentences. You master the art of emotional subtitles. You become a translator for a dialect no one asked to understand. Sometimes, when no one's around, you speak it freely. You whisper your rawest sentences into pillows, into shower walls, into empty rooms that echo you back without judgment. Sometimes your body speaks it for you, your stomach knots, your lungs constrict. You get headaches with no weather behind them. The conversation feels fine on the surface, but your hands are shaking afterward. That was your real voice trying to escape through your skin. It is lonely, carrying a language no one else hears. It makes you doubt its legitimacy. It makes you wonder, if no one understands my pain, is it even real? But it is, even when unnamed, even when unspoken, even when misunderstood. It is still real. Pain doesn't need permission to exist, and tears don't need an audience to mean something. You once cried while explaining joy, because the act of sharing it reminded you how rarely you feel safe doing so. You once laughed while breaking, and someone said, "I love your sense of humor." They didn't notice your eyes were telling another story entirely. Your inner world is multilingual. It speaks fear in the tone of productivity. It speaks grief in nostalgia. It speaks love through caution. But most of all, it speaks loneliness in fluent silence. And you've learned to make art from it, to write beautiful things no one quite gets, to create metaphors that comfort strangers more than your own mouth ever could. You give others the language you yourself are still searching for. That is your paradox. You are most articulate when hiding, most visible when withdrawn. You offer clarity to others, but live inside a fog. Still, there are moments, rare, tender, wild moments, when someone stumbles into your unspoken space and understands it without translation. They ask, "Is there more to what you're saying?" And you exhale something ancient. They notice your pauses. They ask about your metaphors. They don't run from your ache. They sit inside it with you. And in that moment, you are not healed, but you are heard. And sometimes being heard is the most sacred kind of relief. You are still crying. But now the tears are written in a dialect that someone else can almost read. It doesn't fix everything. It doesn't need to. Because being understood was never about being solved. It was about not having to defend what you feel. And maybe this is what hope sounds like. In your language, the quiet click of recognition, the absence of interruption, the echo that answers back. Sometimes you imagine what it would feel like to be entirely understood. Not in pieces, not through questions, but in the quiet recognition that precedes explanation. What if someone heard the storm before the thunder? What if someone could read the space between your words? And nod, not because they've been there, but because they know it's real. Not every emotion needs a mirror. some only need shelter. You begin to realize it's not just that your language is hard to hear. It's that the world has grown impatient with listening. We live in a time of rapid responses, of tidy boxes, of filtered selves. There is little room for the untranslatable. And yet, here you are, carrying an alphabet carved from ache, whispering through wounds, waiting for someone who can read shadows, as fluently as light. But sometimes, even without others, you hear yourself. You speak your unnamed language. Back to yourself in sleep, in memory, in dreams where no one interrupts. There, it pours out freely, a stream of syllables never spoken aloud. And you remember, you don't need fluency to feel. You don't need witnesses to be real. Your pain is valid, even if it's private. Your joy is valid, even if it arrives unannounced and unexplained. Your confusion is sacred because it holds the question open long enough for truth to breathe. There is no wrong way to cry, even if your tears take the form of silence, or retreat, or fragmented thoughts, scribbled in a notebook no one reads. You are allowed to feel without naming. You are allowed to ache in abstract. And one day, without forcing it, you may meet someone whose sorrow harmonizes with yours. Not in perfect pitch, but in perfect permission. You will not need to translate. You will not need to explain. You will simply speak, and they will answer, in the same strange tongue. And in that fragile, miraculous moment, you will know. You were never incoherent. You were never broken. You were simply early. You were simply rare. You were simply speaking a language the world had not yet remembered how to hear. Anger has a shape. At first it is sharp, defined, specific, a response to something real, a boundary crossed, a wound fresh. It points, it shouts, it knows where to go. But over time, it forgets. The shape softens, but the heat remains. It becomes a clenched fist long after the threat is gone. A jaw held tight for no apparent reason. A heart always ready to flinch. At some point, the anger untethers from its memory. It no longer remembers what began the burn. Only that burning feels safer than extinguishing. You move through life with a fire that doesn't know its name. You snap at small things. You bristle at kindness. You avoid softness not because it hurts, but because it reminds you. Of the last time you let your guard down, anger becomes the armor you forgot how to take off. It starts to define you. Like gravity so constant you stop noticing it's there. And when someone asks, "What's wrong?" you can't answer, because the answer is layered, buried beneath years of compression, because the thing that hurt you may no longer exist, but the version of you it created still wakes up every morning, ready for war. Sometimes the anger shows up as restlessness. Other times it wears the costume of control. You organize, you prepare, you stay busy, you do everything except feel the original wound. Because to feel it would be to admit how long it's been running your life. You weren't born this way. The flame had a beginning, but it burned so long you began to think it was part of your skin. And maybe it was useful once. Maybe it protected you. Maybe it gave you clarity in chaos, volume in silence, presence in erasure. But now it's just there. A throb with no source, a tension with no target, a storm that forgot what sky it was made for. It makes you suspicious of peace. It makes you flinch at softness. It tells you that calm is a trick, and that vulnerability is bait. It lies. But it lies in your voice, so it's hard to argue. You try to trace it back. You ask yourself, where did it start? Who taught me this fire? Whose hands did I inherit it from? Sometimes it was a parent, never shouting, just cold. Other times it was betrayal, so quiet you didn't even notice the trust slip through. Sometimes it came from watching others suffer and realizing no one was coming to help. So you lit your own signal flame and forgot to put it out. Sometimes the anger feels righteous, other times it just feels tired. You punch the wall in your mind, but nothing ever breaks. You yell internally, but the echo only answers with more silence. You begin to see, this anger is not current, it is archived, a fossil of a moment that should have been mourned, but was never fully lived. And so it lives on, disguised as drive, as ambition, as defensiveness, as refusal to cry. And now you don't know how to let it go, because it feels like letting go of a part of yourself. But it's not you. It was never you. It was a reaction, a defense, a flame you lit in the dark. So you wouldn't be alone. But you're not in the dark anymore. Now you can name it, not all at once, but in fragments. You can say, I'm not angry at you. I'm angry at how many times I was left unheard. You can say, this isn't rage. This is grief in armor. You can say, I don't want to fight. I just forgot how to stop. And slowly the heat cools, not vanishes, not erased, but cooled into something more honest, a sorrow that can breathe, a hurt that can rest, a history that no longer writes the future. And maybe you'll still feel it, some days more than others, but now you will know its name, and that is the beginning of peace. There is a strange quiet after anger, a silence that doesn't feel like peace, but absence. What once roared, now hums. What once burned, now flickers, uncertain if it should reignite or simply fade. You stand there, watching your own hands, wondering how long they've been fists. You notice the tension in your shoulders, like old scaffolding still holding up a wall. That no longer needs defense. You begin to ask yourself, not why you're angry, but what the anger was trying to protect. What soft thing hid behind the flames? What memory did the fire guard? Like a soldier sleeping with one eye open. Was it the first time you were silenced? The last time you were touched without care? Was it the moment your truth was met with laughter? The year you learned that emotions could be used against you? Anger became your interpreter. It shouted what your fear was too quiet to say. But now you begin to suspect. The fire isn't needed anymore. Now you know how to say no without yelling. Now you know how to walk away without burning bridges on your way out. But the anger doesn't leave all at once. It lingers. It asks, if I go, what will take my place? And the answer is strange, unfamiliar, sometimes terrifying. The answer is grief. Grief soft and enormous, grief without armor, grief that sits in your chest like unspent breath and says, this is what I've been hiding behind your fire. You may resist it at first. Anger feels cleaner, sharper. Grief is messy. Grief seeps. But when you allow it in, something begins to shift. You don't explode anymore. You unravel. You don't rage. You remember, and in remembering, you reclaim something, because beneath the anger was always the original you. Not the defended version, not the flame-bearing warrior, but the quiet child who just wanted to be believed. You see them now, standing behind the smoke, their small hands, not clenched but open, waiting, not for justice, not for apology, but for witness. You don't need to fix the past, to unlearn its reflexes. You only need to feel them, not analyze, not dissect. Just feel. You let the body shake. You let the tears come. Without explanation, you let the memories float, like ashes in dim light. And slowly, the part of you that forgot what started the fire also begins to forget how to keep it going. You breathe. For the first time in years, you breathe without the burn. There is no final word for anger, only thresholds, only softer echoes. It may visit again. You are human, but now you will meet it with gentler hands. You will ask it why it came, instead of letting it speak for you. And that, perhaps more than anything, is how rage becomes wisdom. Not by extinguishing the flame, but by learning to hold the heat without letting it consume. Everything you touch, you will still feel it. But now, you will not mistake it for you. Now you will know its name, and that it has always, always been asking to rest. Sometimes joy arrives, and instead of filling you, it echoes. You feel the lightness, but not the freedom. You feel the warmth, but not the safety. It lands on your chest like sunlight through a cracked window. Brief, beautiful, but somehow wrong. You smile, and something inside recoils. Not because the joy isn't real, but because it arrived, while someone else you love is still drowning. Because it arrived, too early, too loud, too pure, for a world still stitching itself back together. This isn't shame, it's something quieter, more spectral. You wince when you feel good. You check the emotional weather, wondering if it's okay to enjoy this breath, this song, this soft moment. You ask, have I earned this? As if joy were a currency, as if happiness must be justified in the presence of collective grief. You remember laughter in a hospital room and how quickly you silenced it. You remember a sunny afternoon, just after the funeral, and how the light itself felt disrespectful. You've trained your body to dim itself out of solidarity with the dark. And yet, the joy keeps returning. It's not arrogant and it's not naive. It tiptoes in when you're tired of crying. It curls into the corners of mundane things. A good meal, a shared glance, a moment of music that makes your ribs feel like windows. And still, you hesitate, because deep inside a voice says, if others are hurting, I should not be whole. It's a noble lie, a beautifully constructed myth that equates suffering with sincerity. But it is a lie nonetheless. You begin to see, this guilt isn't yours. It was handed to you by culture, by family, by a lineage of people who survived by suppressing brightness. You learned to be small, so others could feel big, to withhold your happiness, in case it made someone else feel less. You were taught that joy is selfish, unless it's shared. But joy doesn't have to be loud to be generous. It doesn't have to be earned. To be sacred, sometimes the most radical act you can commit is to feel joy while the world is on fire, and still believe you are not betraying anyone by smiling, because the fire has always burned. And yet, people have always danced near it, not out of denial, but out of defiance. To feel good despite the ache is not disrespect. It is resistance. It is proof that you are not only surviving, you are still capable of meaning. And yet you still feel it, that twitch of guilt, in the bones of your euphoria. It's okay. Let it be there. Invite it to sit beside the joy, not to erase it, but to witness it. Because maybe joy, too, wants to be seen in its full complexity, not as a clean emotion, but as a conflicted one. Maybe it knows you've seen enough ruin. To be cautious, maybe it knows your body remembers sorrow, even in celebration. So it comes gently. It doesn't demand. It doesn't burst. It whispers, I am not here to replace your pain. I am here to remind you that pain is not the only thing you're allowed to feel. You begin to learn joy doesn't ask for your loyalty. It asks for your honesty. You don't need to dance if your feet are still grieving. But you can rest. You can soften. You can let your mouth curl upward. Without apology, you can feel the sun without proving you deserve it. And slowly, the guilt dissolves, not completely, but enough to let you laugh without looking over your shoulder, enough to let you enjoy your own presence without calculating its cost, enough to feel joy, not as betrayal, but as return. Return to yourself. Return to now. Return to the moment that finally arrived, without needing to be perfect, to be real. There is an art to letting joy stay, not just visit, but stay. You've grown used to joy as a guest who overstays its welcome by merely existing. You rush to clean up after it, to explain it away, to apologize for the brightness it casts. But what if, instead of asking joy to quiet down, you asked guilt to speak? You sit still, you listen. Guilt doesn't shout. It murmurs, I don't want to ruin your happiness. I just didn't know if there was room for me too. And in that moment, you realize they were never at war. Guilt isn't there to sabotage. It is there to ask for acknowledgement, to be seen, to be named, not so it can stay forever, but so it can stop knocking. You learn to breathe in both, to hold joy in one hand and grief in the other, to say, yes, I am happy, and yes, I remember the sadness, and yes, I know others are still hurting, but still, this joy is mine, and it doesn't require your permission. You walk slowly through your own emotional house. You open every door. You stop hiding rooms from yourself. In one room there is mourning, in another music, and in the one you forgot existed, there is light, not blinding, just enough to warm the parts of you that forgot what joy could feel like, without explanation. You stand there. You let the light touch your face. You don't flinch, you don't run, you don't say, "I'm sorry." You simply whisper, "I'm here, I'm feeling this, and I am allowed." And in that whisper, joy becomes yours again, not stolen, not borrowed, not smuggled through shame. Yours, and that changes everything. Not because the guilt disappears, but because it learns how to bow. When joy enters the room, it looks like order, it looks like discipline, it looks like someone who always knows what to do next. But it's not clarity, it's not calm, it's a ritual performed in secret, designed to keep the worst from happening. Even if no one can say what the worst is. You make lists, you check forecasts, you anticipate conversations. That may never occur. You are always rehearsing, packing for disasters that haven't introduced themselves, building blueprints for futures that may not come. It doesn't feel like panic. It feels like productivity, like being on top of things, like staying ahead of the curve. But beneath the posture of readiness is a thrum, a tremble, a quiet sense that something is about to go wrong. And it's your job to catch it before it falls. You weren't born with this. It was installed. By moments when no one showed up, by nights when the floor gave out, by years when your safety depended on seeing it coming before anyone else did. So now you scan for danger, like it's your second language, and you call it strategy. And others applaud it. They admire how organized you are. They call you dependable, efficient, capable, and you nod while hiding the fact that inside you are spiraling. Because to stop preparing feels like collapse. To let go of the checklist feels like walking a tightrope blindfolded. Even rest is rehearsed. Even joy is pre-approved. You plan how to relax, but don't remember how to arrive. You've mastered the art of bracing for criticism, for loss, for that one moment when everything breaks. And you can finally say, "See, I knew it," because that's what the mask protects. Not your mind, but your knowing, your ability to say, "I was right to worry." But even when the worst never comes, you don't feel relief, just a hollow sense of false victory, as if your stress itself was what kept the walls from falling. The mask is a mirror. It shows everyone the version of you that looks most acceptable, but it hides the part that's still holding its breath. You check the locks, you double-check the plans, you monitor the tone of every text, you keep the mask on so well, you forget it's there until it cracks and someone touches your hand, or looks at you too kindly, or asks, "Are you okay?" in a voice that means it. And suddenly, the armor feels like glass. You want to laugh. You want to cry. You want to say, "I don't know how to stop fixing things that haven't broken yet." You want someone to tell you, you don't need to earn peace by predicting pain. You want to trust stillness without suspecting what it's hiding. But that takes practice, not of planning, not of control, but of letting go, without calling it failure. You begin by sitting still, not in preparation, but in presence. You begin by leaving one thing undone, just one. You feel your hands twitch. You hear the voice, "What if?" But you stay, and the world doesn't fall apart. You begin to understand. The worst thing was never the chaos. It was the story that you alone were responsible for preventing it. You are not. You were never meant to be the architect of every outcome. You were meant to live, to rest, to enjoy the space between alarms. You still prepare. But now you leave room for grace. You still think ahead. But now you don't live there. You still wear the mask sometimes, but now you know how to take it off. And beneath it, there is no disaster, only a face learning how to be seen without apology. You start noticing the smaller signals, the way your body tightens at compliments, the way your mind rehearses goodbyes, even in the middle of hello, the way you say just in case, to justify the 1,000 invisible contingencies you've drawn up like battle maps for wars that never come. And maybe the hardest part is admitting that it doesn't make you feel safer, only more tired. Because hyper-readiness isn't peace. It's panic that learned how to dress itself. It walks upright, it files documents, it sets calendar alerts, and triple-checks the lock before the thought even finishes forming. It's exhausting, carrying this much future all the time. And sometimes you miss the present, not because you're distracted, but because you're defending yourself from a version of it that hasn't happened yet. There is a grief in that, a quiet mourning for all the joy you didn't let yourself feel because you were too busy preparing for its disappearance. But here's what begins to change. You let one thing arrive without preparing for it. You say yes without needing a backup plan. You breathe without mapping the next 12 hours. And you survive. Not perfectly, not without tremble, but you survive. In real time, the world doesn't spin out. The people you love don't vanish the moment you let your shoulders drop. You begin to see that preparation never protected you. From pain, it only delayed your ability to feel safe. It built walls, but didn't build peace. And so now, you start slow. You let yourself rest without earning it. You let yourself smile without documenting the reason. You let yourself be unready. And still okay, you forgive yourself for believing control would save you. It did once, when you were younger, when no one came, when things happened too fast, and you thought knowing everything would mean being spared. But you are not that person anymore. You are not in that moment anymore. You can put the clipboard down. You can leave the door unlocked for a little while, because readiness is not the same as worth, and peace is not the absence of risk. It's the willingness to be real, even when the outcome is unknown. You'll still make lists, you'll still show up early, you'll still care. But now, you'll remember that not every possibility needs a plan. Some only need presence, and a deep breath, and a hand unclenched long enough to hold what's here, instead of what might be. Some goodbyes begin before a word is spoken, before the moment ends, before the leaving has a name. You feel it in the shift. A glance that lingers too long, a silence that tightens instead of softens, a pause in the rhythm where something used to live. You start to mourn, while the thing you love is still breathing, and that's what makes it so strange, so difficult to explain, because the world still sees you smiling, still sees you showing up, still sees you together. But you've already begun. The quiet ceremony of letting go. You wake up beside them and grieve the version of you who once believed this would last forever. You walk the halls of your home and begin to whisper thank you to objects you haven't yet decided to pack. You hear their voice, and it echoes like a recording from the past, disguised as the present. This is not nostalgia. This is not fear. This is grief. Premature, precognitive, real. There's a name for grief after loss. There are rituals for it. There are condolences, timelines, and language. But there is no name for the grief that visits too soon, no ceremony for what is still here. So it hides, it finds shelter in the corners of your smile, it lingers behind laughter, it presses into your chest when you're alone, and asks quietly, do they feel it too? Sometimes they do, but neither of you speak it, because naming it feels like summoning it, like confirming the ending, before it's had the decency to arrive. So you carry the weight silently, like holding a funeral for a future version of yourself. You haven't even met yet. You begin to prepare. You memorize the details. You take mental photographs of ordinary things. You say, I love you, as if it's the last time, even when it's not. And still, you don't leave, because the moment hasn't asked you to. Not yet. So you wait, half present, half gone, living in the ache, between staying and knowing. Sometimes this grief arrives in long-term friendships that start to fray, not with arguments, but with silence. Sometimes it comes in your job, your city, your body. You begin to feel the goodbye before anything ends, and that, more than the ending itself, is what breaks you. Because there's no closure in it, only echo, only fog, only the low hum of something sacred, preparing to disappear. You feel selfish for grieving it. You feel dramatic. You feel like maybe you're imagining it. But you're not. You're just noticing what most people wait too long to see. That every moment contains its own impermanence, that nothing stays, not exactly, that even while holding it, you're already learning how to miss it. And maybe there's something holy in that. Maybe this grief isn't punishment. Maybe it's reverence, a soft instinct to begin honoring what has not yet become a memory, but soon will. And maybe the ache you feel isn't because you're weak. It's because you know how to love without holding. You know how to let the goodbye live in your body without rushing the end. That is a rare thing. To mourn without bitterness, to weep without blame, to love something, even while it is slipping away. You stand at the edge of the moment, not to stop it from passing, but to feel it fully, while it still exists. And that is not despair. That is devotion. Grief is often imagined as aftermath, something left behind. But sometimes grief is the echo that arrives. Before the sound even fades, it's standing in a room full of light, and already knowing where the shadows will fall. You try to stay present. You try not to drift ahead of time. But there's a part of you, tender, frightened, wise, that prepares the heart before the loss can bruise it. You speak more gently, You hold them longer. You notice the way the light falls on their cheek, like you're preparing to remember it. You're not giving up, you're tuning in, because you've lived through absence before. You know how suddenly things become memory, how fast now becomes then, how silence has a way of stealing voices mid-sentence. So you learn to listen harder, to savor in fragments, to collect moments. Without capturing them, you begin to understand that grief is not always loud. Sometimes it's a soft rehearsal, a rehearsal for losing without pushing away, a way to love with open palms. And though it aches, you realize this kind of grief is proof that you are awake, that you are feeling all of it, that nothing passed through you unnoticed. There is grace in that, because when the moment truly ends, when the person leaves, or the chapter closes, or the door shuts for the last time, you will have already loved it fully, not retroactively, not in regret, but in real time. This is the quiet gift of early grief. It teaches you how to be here, even as you're letting go. It lets you weep while still holding someone's hand. It lets you say, "I love you," before the silence arrives. It gives you the courage to feel the loss while the heart is still beating. And when the goodbye does come, as all things eventually do, you will meet it, not with surprise, but with softness, because you have already made space. You have already bowed. You have already begun the slow, sacred work of releasing without erasing. And that is the kind of grief that doesn't shatter. It opens, not into nothing, but into meaning. You got what you wanted. The thing arrived. The door opened. The light poured in. And yet, you feel nothing. Not sorrow, not relief, not joy. Just the sound of your own breath bouncing off the walls of something that was supposed to feel like home. This is not disappointment. It's stranger than that. It's the echo of a feeling you rehearsed 1,000 times. But now that it's here, you can't remember how to feel it. You told yourself, once this happens, I'll be happy. Once I get there, I'll feel whole. But you arrive, there's no confetti, no music, no warmth, just stillness, a strange stillness. That feels like forgetting something important, but not knowing what. It's not that the moment is empty, it's that you are, and you don't know why. Maybe the dream was too heavy. Maybe the longing stretched too far. Maybe you built the idea of happiness on scaffolding that was never meant to hold weight. Or maybe you've been surviving for so long that the absence of struggle feels more like loss than peace. Sometimes the emptiness comes because you finally stopped running. You got out of the fire. But now, without the smoke, you don't know where to go. You mistake stillness for numbness. You confuse quiet with absence. You feel guilty for not being flooded with light. In a moment designed for brightness, no one talks about this. No one prepares you for the void that joy sometimes leaves behind. They say happiness fills you, but what about the kind that exposes the space inside? The kind that shines so bright, you suddenly notice just how dark the corners are. You begin to question, was I ever really chasing happiness, or was I just chasing escape? You start to realize maybe what you wanted wasn't the thing itself, but the relief of not wanting anymore. And now that it's here, there's nothing left to run toward. So you look around, and everything feels too quiet. But this is not the end. This is the part no one told you about. The integration, the time between the arrival and the becoming, between expectation and embodiment. Because happiness, true happiness, is not a spark. It's a flame you learn to tend. Slowly, you peel back the layers. You ask gentle questions. You make space for the truth that feeling good doesn't always feel good at first, especially if you're not used to it, especially if joy has always been followed by loss or betrayal or the sudden crash of silence. Sometimes the emptiness is the absence of chaos, and sometimes your nervous system interprets safety as confusion. You don't need to panic. You don't need to fill the silence with noise. You don't need to pretend you're feeling more than you are. You only need to stay in the space, stay in the quiet, stay in the strange stillness of your own becoming, because eventually the echo softens, not all at once, but gradually, like a room warming, like fog clearing, like a smile remembered, rather than forced. You begin to notice smaller things, the way the light feels on your skin, the way your breath moves without urgency, the way your laughter, quiet at first, doesn't need to prove anything. You begin to feel the edges of happiness, not as a flood, but as a slow return to yourself. And this time, you don't chase it, you welcome it, not with trumpets, but with stillness, with presence, with the deep understanding that real joy doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it just stops the bleeding, and that too is a kind of fullness, a quiet fullness, an honest one, the kind that doesn't echo, because it's finally filled with you. Eventually you stop asking, why doesn't this feel like I thought it would? And you start asking, what did I think feeling good was supposed to feel like? Because somewhere along the way, happiness was marketed to you as fireworks, as euphoria, as a cinematic crescendo, with triumphant music and clear skies forever. But the real version is quieter. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand your attention. It moves in slowly, like someone returning home after a long journey through doubt. And sometimes you don't recognize it because you're still looking for the costume it wore. In your imagination, you begin to realize the echo wasn't emptiness. It was your body adjusting to peace, to not having to defend itself, to not expecting loss at every corner. It takes time to trust that you're allowed to feel good without an expiration date. It takes time to believe you don't need to earn every exhale with pain. So you sit with the stillness. You stop demanding it perform. You let it be awkward. You let it feel incomplete. Because beneath that emptiness is something beginning, something soft, something true, a joy that doesn't shout. It stays. It lingers in your quiet mornings. It weaves itself into your breathing. It grows not by being chased, but by being met, without condition. This kind of happiness doesn't dance to be seen. It rests It invites, it forgives you for not knowing what to do with it at first, and you begin to forgive yourself for expecting something more dramatic. You begin to see that, perhaps, what you thought was emptiness was actually wholeness without noise, not the absence of feeling, but the absence of comparison, the absence of needing it to look a certain way. And that's the quiet miracle. The moment you stop measuring your joy against someone else's map, and instead trace your own strange terrain with wonder, and maybe, just maybe, you learn how to feel good without asking if you're doing it right. Maybe the echo fades, not because you filled the silence, but because you became someone who could finally live in it without fear. Not every smile is joy. Some are fences. You learn this early, that the world is more comfortable with your brightness than your ache. So you learn to shine, not because you feel light, but because you need to look like you do. Your smile becomes the most beautiful lie you know how to tell. It doesn't start as deception. It starts as instinct. The first time someone said, "You're so strong," and you didn't feel strong, but you liked the sound of it. The first time someone praised your positivity, but not your honesty. The first time you cried alone and laughed in company because it felt safer that way. That's when the mask formed. White and curved, flawless at first, it fit so well. You forgot it was never part of your skin. And the smile, it stayed. Even when you were tired, even when you were breaking. Especially then, because the world doesn't ask, "Are you safe?" It asks, "Are you okay?" And your smile answers before you do. You begin to feel hollow in places no one can see, because the performance continues, even when the audience leaves. You brush your teeth, look in the mirror, and practice smiling just enough to seem believable. You walk into rooms and light them up, while your own internal switch flickers in the dark. But no one notices, because you've made your survival look like confidence, and some part of you is proud of that. You endured, you adapted, you protected yourself with something soft enough to look like joy. But over time it begins to ache, to wear on the edges, to feel like a weight instead of a shield. Because joy isn't meant to be worn. It's meant to be lived. And the smile that once saved you now traps you in a version of yourself that no longer feels true. So you begin to test the silence. You speak less. You allow your face to rest. You give fewer reassurances, and at first it feels like betrayal, like you're letting people down by being real. But slowly, you realize what you're letting down is the illusion, not your truth. You begin to smile only when it rises naturally. You begin to speak even when your voice trembles. You begin to say, "I'm not okay today," and discover that the world doesn't always fall apart when you do. Sometimes it softens. Sometimes someone reaches for your hand. Instead of your performance, you find that being seen doesn't always lead to punishment. Sometimes it leads to peace, and in those moments, the old smile fades. The one built from tension, from holding the sky in place. In its place grows a new one. Smaller maybe, softer, but real. This smile doesn't ask for applause. It doesn't hide your fear. It simply says, I am still here. I am still becoming. You will still use the old one sometimes, out of habit, out of reflex. That's okay. You've earned the right to protect yourself, however you need. But now you know the difference. Now you can feel it. In your jaw, in your chest, in your breath. Whether the smile is a cage or an opening. And in that knowing, you begin to return to a version of yourself that doesn't need to perform survival. To deserve tenderness, you learn that softness is not weakness, that vulnerability is not a flaw, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let the mask slip and say, this is me, no filter, no polish, just presence. And whoever stays in that moment, whoever sees you without the shine and chooses you anyway, those are the ones worth smiling for. You don't discard the old smile. You honor it. It stayed with you when no one else did. It shielded you in boardrooms, bedrooms, hospitals, hallways, in the 1,000 invisible battles you weren't allowed to name. It earned its place. You nod to it now when you pass mirrors. Not with resentment, but gratitude. You say, thank you for keeping me safe when I didn't know how else to be seen. And then you let your face return to neutral, to rest, to something softer than performance and more alive than defense. You realize you're learning a new language, a vocabulary made of subtle expressions, unforced laughter, real tears. Sometimes you smile now because something inside actually wants to rise, and it's quiet and strange and unfamiliar, but it's yours. Not a signal, not a script, just a flicker of truth, not trying to be anything but itself. You begin to notice who notices. Some people miss it. The absence of your old brightness makes them uncomfortable. They want the show. They want the highlight reel. But others, the right ones, they stay. They lean in. They don't need the full wattage of your shine to feel you. They sit with you in the dim light of honesty and say, this is enough. And it is. You learn that survival is not a static state. It's not just about making it through. It's about returning to the parts of you that were left behind in the rush to stay alive. The smile you wore once was a doorway. Now you get to walk through it. You get to become someone who doesn't smile to be loved, but smiles because they already are. And in this stillness, you ask yourself, what does joy feel like when it isn't armor? The answer is quiet, but you hear it now, and for the first time in years, you smile back. You are not alone. That's what they say. That's what the walls echo back. That's what your phone reminds you of. Messages, photos, names, but you feel it anyway. The absence, the hollowness, the quiet ache of being visible, but not recognized, because it's not about proximity. It never was. You can be surrounded, engaged, even admired, and still feel like your soul is knocking on glass from the inside. This is a different kind of loneliness, not the solitude of silence, but the sharpness of misalignment. It's standing in a room full of mirrors, seeing versions of yourself, reflected back. But none of them are looking into you. only at you, only surface. You speak, but the sound returns warped. You laugh, but it echoes off the walls too cleanly. You reach out, but the touch lands flat, like pressing against your own shadow. You try to be louder, more available, more pleasing, but it only deepens the fracture, because you begin to suspect what they love is not you. It's the image, the echo, the reflection you've trained to respond, the version of you who knows what to say, who nods at the right moments, who smiles without substance. So you become present, but not seen, surrounded, but untouched. And it's exhausting, because mirrors give you back everything, except connection. They shimmer with the illusion of closeness while keeping the real thing just out of reach. You long for someone to shatter the glass, to climb through it, to say, I see the part of you that isn't looking into the mirror at all. But few do, because few know how to look beyond reflections. So instead, you begin with yourself. You stop performing for your own image. You sit with your raw face, your expressionless expression, your unfiltered gaze. You ask, who am I without the echo? And at first, there's silence, a deep, blank silence, but then something stirs, a voice you buried beneath the polish. It speaks not in volume, but in truth. It says, I miss being known, not for what I reflect, but for what I carry. And so you begin the long unlearning. You leave the mirrors, one by one. You step out of rooms where applause replaces understanding. You walk away from conversations that sound bright, but leave you colder. You make space for depth. Not often, not easily, but intentionally. You begin to seek those who don't need a mirror, who bring light with them instead of extracting it from you. You learn to ask different questions. Not, do they like me, but do they know me? And if the answer is no, you no longer make yourself more reflective. You make yourself more real. It's scarier that way, more vulnerable, more uncertain. But it's the only way to stop feeling alone in a room full of reflections, because you weren't meant to echo. You were meant to resonate, to be met, to be mirrored, yes, but by eyes that see past the surface, and slowly you find them, one person, maybe two, no fanfare, no spotlight, just a moment of unguarded presence that says, I'm here, and I'm not just watching you, I'm with you. And in that moment, the loneliness doesn't vanish, it softens, it breathes, because sometimes being known doesn't mean being surrounded. It just means no longer being alone with your reflection. You begin to see how long you've been performing closeness, how many times you nodded at conversations you weren't really in, how many smiles you gave to maintain cohesion, how many stories you reshaped just to remain inside the frame of their comfort. You thought this made you easier to love, but it made you harder to find. Because somewhere in the reflections, you started disappearing. Each polished version of yourself came at the cost of something unspoken, and the loneliness you carry. It isn't just about people, it's about the parts of you abandoned to keep their attention. The child who asked too many questions, the version of you that paused too long before answering. The anger you buried because it wasn't pretty, the wonder you masked because it was inconvenient. You remember them now. In the quiet, in the mirrors you've begun to turn away from. They don't ask for attention. They ask for permission to return. You don't need to be understood by many. Just one, maybe two, maybe yourself, especially yourself. So you start building different rooms, ones without mirrors, ones with windows instead. Open, uneven, letting in wind and imperfection, rooms where you don't have to curate your reflection, where presence is enough, where someone can sit beside you in silence and still feel connection. Not because of what you project, but because of what you allow. You start seeking those who don't rush to label your emotions, who let you unfold slowly, awkwardly, without needing to be translated. People who don't flinch. When you say, "I don't know who I am today," people who say, "That's okay, I'll be here anyway." And when you find them, even if just one, it changes something. You don't need to shout anymore. You don't need to shine. You just need to breathe and be held in the soft gravity of someone who sees you, not as a mirror, but as a sky, wide, unfinished, real. And suddenly the loneliness begins to lose its shape, not gone, but no longer echoing endlessly, no longer bouncing back at you from every surface, just quiet now, just resting, just waiting for connection. You no longer have to earn by disappearing. You know how it starts. The first notes drop, like slow rain, on something inside you that was already wet with remembering. A voice, soft or broken, draws a shape around your silence, and you listen, not for the lyrics, but for the feeling beneath them. It's not about the words. It's the ache between the chords, the way the melody lands, just where your chest has been too quiet. You hit repeat, not because the pain is addictive, but because it feels like home, because the song understands something no one around you does, because for the length of a few minutes you are not required to explain. What hurts? You don't cry to feel worse. You cry because the song gives you permission, because its sorrow is honest. And that honesty is rare. You've tried cheering up. You've tried fixing it. You've tried gratitude. But sadness doesn't want to be solved. It wants to be heard. And this song, this sad, slow, broken thing, it listens back. It doesn't flinch at your grief. It doesn't say, "This too shall pass." It says, "Yes, this hurts, and I'm here with you." You play it again and again and again, not to deepen the wound, but to tend to it. Because sometimes repetition is ritual. Sometimes looping the sadness is the only way to make peace with it. You hum along, or don't. You close your eyes not to escape, but to arrive, here, fully, inside whatever this is. The song holds space. For feelings too large to label, it becomes a container. For your anger, for your tenderness, for your missing. The music says what you can't, and in doing so it makes the unspeakable bearable. It's strange, isn't it? How sadness can be the most reliable companion, not because you enjoy it, but because it asks for nothing except truth, No smile, no resolution, just honesty. You realize this song knows you, in a way most people don't. Not because it has answers, but because it doesn't try to change the question. It lets you be fractured, without rushing you into wholeness. And that is healing, not in the bright, clean, cinematic way, but in the quiet, gritty, personal way. That happens when you feel safe enough to be unwell, without shame, so you play it again, not to get lost, but to be found by something that never asked you to be okay, only real. And in that, you are comforted, not cured, not saved, but held by a sound that breaks with you and never walks away. There's a moment, somewhere around the third or fourth listen, when the song stops being music and becomes mirror. It stops being theirs and becomes yours. The voice is no longer someone else's sadness. It's your own, traveling back to you, through borrowed melody. And in that moment, you feel seen, not for your strength, not for your resilience, but for your sorrow, untouched, unjustified, unapologetic. You remember the way you once cried, in the middle of a crowded room, without shedding a single tear. You remember the weight in your throat that words could never carry. This song remembers too. That's why it returns with you every time, not to haunt, but to witness, because grief is never finished. It's just quieter now. It no longer screams. It hums. You find that you're not repeating the song to prolong the sadness. You're repeating it to soften it, to give it shape, to keep it company, so it doesn't have to sleep alone. Somewhere along the loop, you stop crying, not because the sadness is gone, but because it's been heard, fully, finally, and there is a kind of release that follows being understood by something that doesn't talk back, that doesn't judge your silence, that doesn't offer advice. It just stays, like the kindest kind of memory, or the ghost of someone you never got to say goodbye to, but who stayed anyway. And eventually you let the final notes fade. You lift your finger from repeat, not because the pain has ended, but because it has rested. For now, and that's enough. You carry it gently back into the world, not as a weight, but as a chord, still vibrating somewhere in your ribs, a reminder that sadness, when honored, doesn't rot. It becomes music, and that music, when repeated, becomes home. Love doesn't always bloom in light. Sometimes it begins underground, in the cracks between what was allowed and what was real. It grows in silence, in glances not meant to linger, in late-night thoughts you don't tell anyone about. It starts small, a leaf against stone, a softness beneath ruin. You don't mean to water it. You tell yourself it's just admiration, just warmth, just proximity. But something takes root anyway, not because it's convenient, not because it's returned, but because your heart doesn't ask for permission. Only possibility. This is the kind of love that feels like trespassing. It doesn't fit the blueprint. It wasn't in the plan. You didn't even know. There was space inside you that needed this shape, but there it is, growing anyway. At first you resist it. You reason with it. You warn it, you bury it beneath logic, but it keeps growing, sideways, secretly, and over time you begin to notice. Not all love is meant to stay, but some love is meant to teach, to stretch your heart, in directions it forgot existed, to remind you what it means to ache beautifully. You wonder if it's wrong to want something that was never meant to be yours. But the wanting itself is tender. It doesn't demand, it doesn't consume, it simply glows. Quietly. This love doesn't knock down walls, it doesn't scream through windows. It waits, not for the ending, not for the beginning, just for the moment. You admit to yourself that it's real. You begin to care for it, like a secret garden, not to harvest, but to protect. You trace its edges, you let it breathe, you stop calling it a mistake, because not all misplaced things are wrong. Some are just misaligned. Beautifully, love, even when it can't stay, still leaves something behind. A softness in your eyes, a slowness in your breath, a memory that doesn't hurt, just hums. And maybe you'll never say it out loud. Maybe no one will ever know. But you will. You'll know you carried something delicate and wild and impossibly brave, and it made you better. Not in outcome, but in depth, because love that grows where it shouldn't still knows how to bloom, and bloom it did, even in the shadow, even in silence, even without a name. You begin to notice how quietly it changed you. This love dash, unspoken, unconsummated, unfulfilled. It didn't give you a future, it didn't offer safety, but it gave you something else. It reminded you that you are capable of depth, even when no one dives in with you. It reminded you that longing is not weakness, that wanting without receiving is still sacred. You carry it like a poem no one else has read, not out of shame, but because some things are too real to be reduced to plot. This love never asked to be held, it asked to be honored. And you did. You honored it, by not pretending it was smaller than it was, by not forcing it to make sense, by letting it exist. Outside of outcomes, you let it hurt, but you didn't punish it for hurting. You let it glow, but you didn't demand it illuminate your life. You let it live in the space where impossible things go, to feel true for a while. And now it doesn't ache like it used to. Now it lingers like a scent on clothes you no longer wear, but still keep folded in the back of the drawer. You smile when you think of it. Not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. Because not all love is meant to be finished. Some is meant to be felt, to enter quietly, stir the soul, and leave a crack in the walls, wide enough for light to find its way in. And you are more alive now, not because you possessed it, but because you let it pass through you, without closing the door too soon. Love that grows where it shouldn't teaches you that the heart is not a map, it is a wilderness, and even in forbidden places, flowers will find a way to bloom. It sounded so convincing. It used your voice. It made lists. It planned ahead. It spoke calmly, measured, precise. It even called itself realistic. And you believed it, Because fear rarely knocks as fear. It enters as a thought, then a series of reasons, then a strategy that looks suspiciously like avoidance. You didn't recognize it at first, because this fear didn't tremble. It calculated. It studied the angles. It pointed to statistics. It whispered, just being careful. And yet, your body knew. There was a tightness in your breath that logic couldn't explain. A clenching in your jaw whenever something good got too close. A sudden need to plan 5 exits. From a room no one was asking you to leave. You called it intelligence. They called you grounded. But inside, you were retreating. Fear doesn't always shout. Sometimes it speaks like a scientist. Sometimes it builds arguments. So airtight, nothing tender can get in. It convinces you that curiosity is dangerous, that risks are recklessness, that softness is a trap. And it is so good at this, so fluent in rationale, that you forget to question it. You forget that fear often masquerades as the voice of reason, that it builds fences and calls them boundaries, that it tightens your world and calls it safety. You stopped applying for things you wanted. You stopped texting back. If someone got too close, you avoided asking big questions because small answers were easier to control. And when doubt whispered, you called it discernment. When hesitation screamed, you called it wisdom. But really, you were just scared, scared to want, scared to need, scared to lose something you hadn't even let yourself reach for. It's not your fault. Fear is clever. It's patient. It waits until you're tired, then offers you structure instead of freedom. But now you're starting to see it, not all at once, but in flashes. You notice how certain thoughts show up right before you say yes to something new. You notice how decisions that feel smart also feel small, dry, unalive. You notice how often you use the word should, when the real word is want. And in that noticing, you begin the unbuilding. You start to ask, is this choice from clarity or contraction? Is this boundary from self-respect or self-protection? Is this silence because I'm wise or because I'm afraid of what I'd say out loud? The answers aren't always clean, but they're honest, and honesty is what fear cannot survive. You begin to speak back to it, not aggressively, but firmly. You say, I see you. I know you're trying to protect me, but I'm not in danger anymore. You start letting yourself want things without needing guarantees. You start making choices that don't always make sense, but feel right. You start opening doors without reading the fire code first. You learn that courage is not the absence of fear. It's the refusal to confuse it with truth. And slowly the voice changes. It's still there. It still advises. But now it asks instead of commands. It walks beside you instead of in front. It stops mistaking panic for preparation. And you begin to live again, not recklessly, not carelessly, but freely. You begin to understand that logic isn't the opposite of fear. Trust is, and trust is what grows in the space fear used to fill. Fear is rarely loud, not the kind that really runs your life, not the kind that shapes your choices, and still pretends it had nothing to do with them. That kind of fear is elegant, efficient. It wears suits, it builds spreadsheets, it lives in flow charts and measured tones. It says, let's be realistic. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's think this through. Again, it offers you a version of life that is tidy, linear, almost believable. And the cost, desire, vulnerability, mess, color. The cost is risk. The cost is intimacy. The cost is that you start shrinking your dreams just enough that they'll fit through the narrow hallway of certainty. And you call it maturity. You call it being rational, being grounded, being someone who makes good decisions. But somewhere inside, you start to feel brittle, over-defined, unmoved, because you've confused emotional safety with emotional absence. You've mistaken numbness for stability. You say no before life even has a chance to ask the question. You play devil's advocate so often that the angel in you stops raising her hand. And then, quietly, curiously, you begin to notice the wear, the subtle dread before good things, the strange guilt after a moment of spontaneous joy. The way you apologize for wanting things you never let yourself name. You start to suspect that what you've called logic has been fear in costume, and fear, when unchallenged, becomes religion. It writes commandments about how much is too much. It declares your longing a liability. It recasts softness as a structural weakness. But even the smartest fear has a tell, and it's this. It always comes with contraction. It makes your body smaller, your breath tighter, your words more defensive. It creates a world where you never get hurt, but also never get close. You begin to see how many of your best qualities were once just survival tactics, your clarity, a way to avoid being misunderstood, your independence, a way to not be disappointed, your caution, a way to pre-grieve what might go wrong. And now you're ready for something else. You want a voice inside you that doesn't just calculate risk, but recognizes meaning. You want a self who doesn't just keep you alive, but invites you to live. That transition won't be fast. Fear has built an empire in you. Quiet, lawful, convincing, but slowly you begin to push against it, not with force, with truth. You ask, what if this time I choose joy over justification? What if this isn't irrational, just unfamiliar? What if safety isn't the goal? What if presence is? You begin to say yes. Before certainty arrives, you begin to move toward things. Without rehearsing your exit, you begin to feel the fear and let it stay. Without letting it speak first, you begin to choose. Not the smartest path, but the most alive one, and that is how fear becomes guide instead of gatekeeper, not by vanishing, but by being seen. And when it no longer needs to wear the mask of logic, it becomes something softer, something more human, a part of you that just needed to be heard without being handed the keys. There are no tears, no broken glass, no sharp edges to point at and say, "Look, this is where it hurts." There is only stillness, stillness so thick you can't move through it, stillness that hums under your skin, like a frequency only your bones understand. They ask how you're doing. You smile. You nod. You reply with words that sound fine, but taste like static, because silence has learned to mimic peace, because stillness has been mistaken for strength. But this is not peace. This is containment, and containment is not the same. As calm, there's a scream inside you that never found its shape, a vibration that never made it into sound, a sentence that got stuck mid-breath, and now it lives in your body. Not as noise, but as pressure, in your throat, in your chest, in the corners of your eyes, that stay dry. Even when your heart is drowning, you're not hiding the pain. You've just made it quiet. You've learned how to tuck it behind your posture, your productivity, your practiced laugh. And they call you composed. They call you resilient. They call you so strong. But strength sometimes is what happens when no one gives you permission to be anything else, when the only choice left is to swallow the sound before it betrays you, so you carry it, not as a secret, but as a rhythm, the pulse of everything you never got to say, throbbing softly beneath your calm exterior. You want to scream, not to be heard, but to be emptied, to stop being the container, to be the sound itself, wild, untranslatable, undeniable. But you're afraid that once it starts, it won't stop, that your scream will become a flood, that it will wash away everything you've built to stay upright. So instead, you go silent. Even your silence has posture now. But somewhere, quietly, stubbornly, the body remembers. It sends signals. It misbehaves. Tension, fatigue, dreams that unspool into chaos, panic that shows up dressed as routine. Your body doesn't want revenge. It wants release. It wants you to listen to what your mouth never said, to what your eyes tried to hold back, to what your voice buried in the interest of being fine. You don't need to scream to be loud. You don't need to cry to be breaking, but you do need to stop pretending. That silence means safety. You do need to hear yourself, all of yourself, even the parts that don't make sense, even the parts you locked away because they didn't sound like you at your best. You are not always your best. You are not always composed. You are not always rational. And thank God, because the scream you've buried might not be destruction. It might be the beginning of something true. You don't have to shout it, but you can let it rise. You can let it shake your breath. You can let it echo in your own chest until it no longer needs to be held alone. You can make space for the scream to become a sentence, a sound, a signal that you're here, still feeling, still alive. Even when you say nothing, you begin to understand. Not every scream must be heard to be released. Some are felt softly in the unclenching of the jaw, in the sigh that didn't need permission, in the moment you tell the truth. To no one but yourself. You don't need to break. You don't need to collapse. You only need to soften, to give the silence another shape, besides tightness, because the longer you hold it, the louder it becomes, even if no one hears it, even if it never touches air. So you start small. You speak one line, a simple sentence that doesn't sound dramatic, but feels like thunder when it leaves your lips. Something like, "I'm not okay." Orient, "I don't know how to keep pretending." And nothing explodes. The world stays intact. The room doesn't fracture, but something inside you unfolds, uncoils, takes its first real breath in years. You let the silence expand, not as suppression, but as space. Space to feel, space to not know, space to let the scream inside you become a voice instead of a prison. This isn't about volume, it's about honesty. And as the truth rises, you find it's not anger, it's not chaos, it's grief, unspoken, ungrieved, unwitnessed sorrow. That mistook silence for safety and composure for healing. Now you know better, now you see that your stillness was not peace. It was pause, a necessary one, yes, but not the final word. Now you begin to move again, not fast, not far, but inward, toward yourself, toward the center of what you've held. For too long, you do not scream, but you do not hide it anymore. It sits beside you now. This once lonely sound, this almost scream, it doesn't need to escape, it only needed to be seen. And now it is. It settled in early, not all at once, but slowly, like dust, layer by layer, quiet, invisible, familiar. You don't remember where it began, only that at some point you started believing you were too much, or not enough. You confused attention with approval, silence with punishment. You learned to read the air before you learned to read yourself. And somewhere in that reading, you found shame, not because you did something wrong, but because someone else didn't know how to hold what was soft in you. And so you learned to carry it, their discomfort, their fragility, their fear of feeling. You carried their reactions. Like they were reflections, you mistook their rejection for a mirror. And you asked yourself, what did I do wrong? Why am I always too loud, too sensitive, too much? But what if the shame was never yours? What if it was handed to you by people who didn't know what to do with their own? What if your sadness was punished because it reminded them of theirs? What if your joy was dimmed because it outshined their pain? What if they called your truth selfish because it interrupted the illusion they were trying to maintain? You were not broken, you were just bright, in a room that had grown too used to the dark. And so you began to shrink, not because you were small, but because you were trying not to take up space that had already been claimed by someone else's silence. You tiptoed, you over-explained, you apologized for existing in the shape you came in, and they called it humility. They called it maturity. They called it being easy to love. But it was not love, it was absence wearing the mask of acceptance. And now, you're tired. Not just physically, existentially. You're tired of shrinking into rooms that were never big enough to hold you. You begin to trace the shame, follow it back. Whose voice was it really? Whose gaze taught you to flinch? Whose silence taught you to doubt? And then you begin the slow work of setting it down, not because you're angry, But because it's too heavy, because it's not yours, because you're done mistaking pain for identity, you speak softly to yourself now. You say, I am not the weight you could not carry. I am not the consequence of your absence. I am not wrong for being who I am. You do not need to rehearse smallness. To be safe, you do not need to feel guilty for taking up space with your truth. You can unlearn the reflex. To make yourself palatable, you can make joy again. Without checking if it's allowed, you can name your wants. Without apology, because what they called shame was just your shape. Before it was edited, what they called too much was just your depth. Before it was quieted, and what they tried to place on your back is no longer yours to hold. You don't have to throw it. You don't have to burn it. You just have to stop bending beneath it, as if it belongs to you. And one day, you'll stand in your own skin, without bracing for correction, and it will feel like remembering who you were before you learned to hide. You start noticing how much of your life has been lived in response, not creation, not expansion, but response. To others' discomfort, to unspoken rules, to expectations too tight for your skin. You dressed your truth in politeness. You learned to scan a room faster than your own feelings. You anticipated rejection before you even showed up. But now you're beginning to question, who were you before the performance? Before you made yourself easier to love? By being harder on yourself before you offered every truth? With a disclaimer, before you held your laughter in your teeth? Just in case it took up too much space, you start to unlayer. Not dramatically, not loudly, but deliberately, you allow yourself to show up. Without the disclaimers, you speak a little slower. Not to sound wise, but because you're no longer racing. To be accepted. You feel the ache of all the versions of you that twisted themselves to be held by hands that never knew how to hold. And you grieve them, all of them, not to return, but to thank. They kept you safe. They kept you close. They did what they knew. But now you know more. Now you know that you don't need to silence your power. To keep the peace, you don't need to agree. To be included, you don't need to smile. To deserve belonging. You realize that the people who asked you to shrink were never really seeing you. They were seeing a version of themselves reflected in your restraint. And now you are done reflecting. You are done absorbing. You are done carrying. This shame, this shape they mistook you for, melts in the light of your noticing. You say, I see you. I see the burden, and I see that it is not mine. And in that sentence, the weight loosens. It doesn't fall all at once, but it begins. Your spine unbends, your voice returns, your presence widens, not into rebellion, but into truth, because sometimes healing is not a revolution. It's a quiet refusal, a refusal to keep playing roles you never auditioned for, a refusal to carry what was never yours to begin with. You lay the shame down, and when no one comes to claim it, you know you were right to set it down. You were right to walk away, and finally you are free to walk forward. Not as a reaction, but as yourself. No disguise, no explanation, just breathe and belonging. It begins like all hope does, soft, earnest, bright, a flicker, a shape forming in the dark, the quiet belief that something better might still be coming. And sometimes it does, but other times hope stays too long. It doesn't transform, it calcifies. It becomes not a doorway, but a loop. You find yourself circling the same thought. Maybe this time, maybe they'll change. Maybe if I wait a little longer. You call it faith, they call it optimism, but inside you feel it stretching, thinning, becoming fragile in your hands. You don't want to let go, because letting go feels like betrayal, like defeat. But the longer you hold it, the heavier it becomes. And what once lifted you now roots you in place. You tell yourself, at least hope is better than despair. But despair has its own honesty, its own clarity. Hope, when it turns, can become a cage made of light. It lets you see the door, but never walk through it. It makes you wait for permission. That will never come. You keep showing up for something that doesn't arrive. Not because you're weak, but because hope taught you. That persistence is noble, even when it's painful. You don't want to be someone who gave up. You don't want to be someone who stopped believing. So you stay longer than you should, longer than it's kind. And each day you bend a little more to fit the shape of that waiting. You shrink to stay loyal to a future that was promised, but never planted. Hope, at its worst, becomes the longing you can't put down. It sings lullabies to your wounds. It offers just enough warmth to keep you from leaving. It convinces you that to hope is to love. But real love does not ask you to abandon yourself in its name. And real hope, the kind that heals, makes space for honesty. It lets you grieve what hasn't come. It lets you name what may never arrive. It lets you say, I wanted this. I waited. It didn't come. And that's not failure. That's release. That's the sacred act of choosing clarity over fantasy, not because you stopped hoping, but because your hope finally matured into trust, trust in yourself, in the life that still exists. Beyond the version you imagined, you can set hope down. Without bitterness, you can say, thank you for keeping me afloat when I needed something to hold. But now I need my hands free. You are not giving up. You are giving back what was never yours to carry forever. And in that space, something new begins. Not a lesser hope, a truer one. One that doesn't dangle conditions, one that doesn't hurt to hold, one that doesn't require your suffering. As proof of your faith, a hope that opens, not waits, a hope that moves, not clings, a hope that knows. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is walk forward without needing to be certain, because sometimes healing is not about what you hope for. It's about what you stop hoping for. So you can start living. You wake one morning and realize the waiting has gone quiet. Not because the dream has come true, but because you're no longer waiting for it to. There's no dramatic closure, no final refusal, just a stillness where expectation used to live. And in that stillness, you find yourself again. The part of you that exists outside of reaching, the part of you that is not a request, but a presence. You look around and see that the world hasn't ended. It simply looks different. Without the tint of someday, you see the things you missed while holding out for more. You feel the space that longing once occupied, and you begin to fill it with what is actually here, not what was promised, but what has always been. Quietly available, you water the plant. That's never bloomed, not because you expect it to, but because caring for it feels like choosing yourself. You respond to kindness without reading it as foreshadowing. You feel joy without asking what it means. And this is not giving up. This is returning to your own hands, to your own breath, to your own timeline, where hope is no longer a cliff you keep stepping off, but a ground you finally built beneath your feet. You no longer need it to be magic. You only need it to be honest. And if something comes, you will greet it. But if it doesn't, you will not wait by the door forever. You will go outside. You will walk. You will live. Because hope is not the place you were meant to stay. It was the bridge. And now, you have crossed it. It doesn't feel like emptiness. It feels like noise, with no center, a dull static buzzing behind your forehead, beneath your ribs, under your skin. You're not sad. You're not fine. You're not anything. You are the absence of signal. You are the sound of an unanswered line ringing into a room. No one is in. People ask how you are. You say, I'm okay. And that's not a lie. It's a placeholder. Because to answer truthfully would mean trying to describe a color that doesn't exist, a silence that shouts, a weight with no texture. You go through the motions. You laugh at the right moments. You say yes when it's easiest. You reply with emojis because your real emotions are buffering. But inside, everything is flattened, distorted, overexposed. The world feels too loud and too far away. At the same time, joy doesn't land. Sadness doesn't rise. You stare at the wall and feel it staring back. And maybe the worst part is, no one notices because numbness performs well. It's clean, it's manageable. It looks a lot like functionality. And for that you are praised. You're handling things. You're resilient. You're so strong. But you're not strong. You're silent. And the silence is not peace. It is a scream with nowhere to go. A pressure beneath the surface that never explodes, just hums, louder when you're alone, louder when you try to sleep, louder when someone asks, what's wrong? And you truly don't know. Because numbness is not nothing. It's not the absence of feeling. It's too many feelings, compressed into static. It's the body's last defense against drowning. When sadness was too big, when anger was too dangerous, when longing was too heavy. So everything went quiet, like a system shutting down, to avoid burning out. And it worked. For a while. But now you miss yourself. Not the performative version, not the always on, always pleasing, doing better, thanks for asking self. The real one, the one who used to feel things, who used to cry at music, who used to get excited about nothing in particular. You want them back, so you start slow. You touch things, textures, cold water, warm clothes, the softness of your own palm. You breathe on purpose. Even if you can't feel the breath yet, you stop expecting joy to crash through the door. You start listening for its whisper, and eventually, not all at once, you notice something. A flicker in the noise, a real laugh, unpracticed, a sigh that felt like yours. Not because the numbness is gone, but because for a moment you moved beneath it. And that's how it loosens. Not through force, through noticing. You keep noticing. A small ache, a quiet want, a vague tenderness toward something you thought you stopped caring about. And this is how you begin again. Not by waking up whole, but by learning to feel, in fractions, by letting the silence unravel into language, by letting the static soften into signal, by remembering that numbness is not your failure. It is your body's attempt to keep you safe when everything else went too sharp. And now that it's quieter, you can begin to return. Not with fireworks, not with clarity, just with presence. And presence is how you start to feel, without fear. That feeling will undo you. You are not gone. You are just paused. And now, you're pressing play. You start to realize that numbness isn't a void. It's a holding pattern, a liminal space your heart built. When feeling became too sharp, and the world too close, it wasn't weakness, it was protection, like scar tissue over a wound that never closed properly. It wasn't meant to stay forever, just until it was safe to feel again. And now the silence doesn't feel like shelter. It feels like distance. And distance, when no longer necessary, becomes loneliness. So you reach, not for rescue, but for reconnection. You say something true, to someone, to yourself. It doesn't need to be deep, only real. I don't feel like myself lately. I miss who I was. I'm scared I can't get back. And that soft truth is a spark, not enough to light the room, but enough to warm your hands. You begin to track sensations you once ignored. The tremble behind your laughter, the tightness in your chest when the phone rings, the way music sometimes makes your stomach ache before your ears catch up. You don't judge it, you document it, like rediscovering a language you used to speak before everything went quiet. You learn to sit in your own silence without mistaking it for disappearance, because you're still here. You've always been here, even in the stillness, even in the white noise. You feel life move differently now, not as a jolt, but as a pulse. Slow, deep, true. You begin to understand that healing is not an awakening, it is a listening. And when you finally hear yourself again, not in echo, but in full, you will know the numbness never erased you. It only waited, patiently, painfully, for your return. It started as a gift, the ability to feel what others wouldn't say, to sense the tremble behind someone's smile, to absorb pain before it reached the surface. You were the quiet one, the listener, the one who knew when to speak and when silence would say more. You learned to scan the room before you even knew how to speak, to make yourself small, so others could feel big, to carry feelings that weren't yours, because you were the only one who noticed they existed. They called it empathy. They praised your intuition. They said, "You're so good with people." And you were. But over time, you became a container. You made room for everyone else's grief, rage, doubt, longing, and you forgot how to hold your own. You said, "It's fine," when it wasn't. You comforted others, while your heart screamed in the language you never learned how to translate. Your empathy became a performance of patience, a routine of emotional triage. You called it love, you called it service, but beneath the care was a quiet erosion, because every time you made space for someone else, you took a little from your own. Every time you said yes to their pain, you said no to your own bandwidth. And now you're full, not of yourself, but of everyone else's noise. You've become a room where other people come to cry, but no one thinks to ask if you need to weep too. You've become safe at the cost of feeling seen. And the worst part, you don't blame them. You taught them that you had no limits. You made your empathy look effortless, so they leaned and leaned and leaned until you forgot what it feels like to stand upright. You try to step back, and guilt follows. You try to say no, and it echoes like betrayal, because now your kindness is an expectation, not a choice. And empathy, the thing that once opened you, now encloses you. Now it keeps you inside other people's stories, while your own goes unwritten. You begin to wonder, can you care without dissolving? Can you listen without disappearing? The answer is yes, but only if you remember that empathy is not a vow of silence. It is not martyrdom. It is not self-erasure in the name of compassion. Empathy is a bridge, not a home. You were never meant to live in other people's feelings, only to visit, only to witness, not to inherit. So now you begin to return to yourself, to your body, to your own narrative. You say, "I care for you, but I cannot carry you. I see your pain, but I will not wear it." You start naming your limits without apology. You start tending your wounds. Even if no one else sees them, you start recognizing that the most sacred kind of empathy includes you, not as a vessel, but as a person, whole, feeling, worthy of being held, just as much as you hold. And in that shift, you break the cage, not by closing your heart, but by including yourself inside it. And suddenly there is space again, not for everything, but for what matters. And for once, what matters includes you. It takes practice to unhook from pain that isn't yours, to feel it pass through without wrapping around your ribs. You begin to notice the moment just before the merge, that tiny edge where their sorrow reaches for you, and you used to say yes. By reflex, now you pause. Now you ask, is this mine to carry? Not to be cold, not to be distant, but to stay human, without becoming hollow. You start tending the boundary, not as a wall, but as a garden gate. something you can open when it serves you, and close when your roots need tending, because empathy without boundary is absorption, and absorption unchecked becomes disappearance. You are not a sponge. You are not a sinkhole. You are not the final resting place for everyone else's emotional debris. You are a person, a presence, a heartbeat, and you deserve to feel your own. Without distortion, you learn to say, "I understand." Without following it with self-sacrifice, you learn to sit beside pain without drowning in it. You learn to love people without letting their storm redefine your weather. And that is the soft revolution, to still be warm, but no longer on fire, to still offer your hands, but keep your center intact, to still feel deeply, but know deeply where you end and where they begin. And now, empathy becomes what it was always meant to be. Not a cage, but a connection, one you can enter and leave without disappearing, one that heals without hollowing you out. And for the first time in years, you feel what it's like to care without crumbling, and you breathe for yourself. It wasn't a choice, not really. You didn't sit down one morning and decide to release them. You didn't rehearse grace. You didn't feel whole or wise or magnanimous. You just got tired, tired of the weight, tired of carrying their name in your chest like a splinter, tired of remembering things you never got to say. So one day, without warning, without ceremony, you let the rope go, not because they asked, not because they earned it, but because holding it any longer would mean losing parts of yourself you wanted to keep. This was not the beautiful kind of forgiveness, not the radiant transformation, with soft music and closure. It was quieter, grayer, almost accidental, a kind of forgetting. That began with remembering you had a life beyond the wound. At first, it didn't feel like healing. It felt like loss. The anger had been an anchor, a compass, a reason, and now, without it, you floated. You questioned it. Does this mean what they did was okay? Does this mean I've betrayed myself? But the deeper truth was this: you didn't forgive them. You just stopped feeding the fire. They lit in you. You let the wound close without needing to prove how deep it went. And in that act, you found something softer than justice. You found yourself, not as victim, not as survivor, but as person, present, unbound. And yes, the past still echoes, some days louder than others. But it no longer controls your volume. It no longer decides the shape of your breath. You stopped rewriting the story, hoping they'd return and read it differently. You started writing new ones, not for them, for you. Stories where they are not the ending, where closure is not something given, but grown. You forgive them, not because they deserve peace, but because you do, because you were never meant to carry their apology as a prerequisite for your freedom, because some forgiveness isn't about the other person at all. It's the quiet decision to stop waiting for something that may never come, and instead to return to yourself. You still remember what they did. Forgiveness did not erase it. It did not soften the sharpness, did not rewrite the scenes, but it made you the author again. You stopped waiting for an apology, spoken in the exact tone, at the right time, with all the right words. You stopped imagining the confrontation that would fix what was already broken too long. You realized there are wounds that only heal once you stop asking them to make sense. You do not forgive because you're okay with it. You forgive because you are done letting it define what okay means and what once felt like surrender. You see now was release, not of accountability, but of tether. You no longer need to carry the version of yourself who kept repeating the pain just to prove it was real. It was real, and now you get to walk differently, not away from the past, but beyond its gravity. You don't need a moment to make it complete. You are the moment. You are the threshold. And as you step through, you realize forgiveness is not a gift you give to them. It is a door you walk through when you are ready to stop waiting at theirs. You pictured it so many times, the way you'd step forward, the look in their eyes, the silence before it softened. You practiced it in mirrors, in dreams, in imagined reunions, where timing had finally caught up to what your heart always knew. The hug wasn't just contact, it was confession. It said, I remember you. I miss you. I never stopped hoping you'd show up differently. But you never gave it, not because you didn't want to, but because the moment never arrived. Not the way it was supposed to, not with the safety it required. You waited. Maybe they did too. But the world kept turning, and the timing stayed off, by just enough to keep your arms at your sides. You loved them, but they were dangerous, or distant, or not who they once were. You stayed safe. You stayed silent, and in some strange way, that was its own kind of love, too. Because some hugs aren't healing, some hugs reopen things you worked too hard to seal, so you never gave it. And still, it lives in you, in your shoulders when you hear their name, in your ribs when an old photo surfaces, in the small breath you didn't take when you had the chance. You wonder what it would have meant. You wonder if it would have made anything better, or worse, or enough. But here's what's true. The hug was real, even if it never happened. Because the tenderness was real. The want was real. The ache was real. You loved them in your way. And you held that love inside your body like an unopened letter with no address left. It doesn't mean you're broken. It means you cared. Where care had no landing place. It means you practiced softness in a world that didn't always make room for it. It means you knew what connection could be, even when it never arrived. And maybe that's enough. To know you had love to give. To know you almost did. To know you were ready. To reach, to risk, to remember. And even though the moment never came, you lived it anyway, in your chest, in your breath, in the quiet rehearsal that no one else witnessed. Some part of you still hugs them in dreams, still finishes the sentence, still finds closure without touch. And that's the thing about love. Even when it goes unspoken, even when it's paused before the final step, it lives, not in the hug that never came, but in the soul that was willing to give it. You stop waiting for the moment, stop revisiting the pause where it should have happened. You begin to understand that some moments only ever exist inside us, and that doesn't make them less real. You carried that hug like a candle in a locked room, not for warmth, but for memory. You didn't give it because the world wasn't ready, because they weren't ready, because you weren't ready to offer touch without promise. And that was wise. You didn't withhold it out of spite. You withheld it out of self-preservation, because your arms aren't just bridges. They are homes, and you don't open them to storms anymore. Still, there's grief in what never happened. There always is. But grief isn't just for what ended, it's also for what never began. And this was a beginning that never got the breath to speak itself into being. So now you hold the shape of it, a little more gently. You let it live, as memory, as rehearsal, as proof that your heart still tries. And if one day you find yourself in another almost moment, someone standing close, history on both your shoulders, you'll decide again, not from fear, not from guilt, but from presence. And maybe this time you'll step forward, or maybe you'll smile and stay still. But either way, you'll know you are not the hug withheld. You are the love that stayed. You say it without thinking. I'm fine. Smooth, automatic, painless, a phrase so rehearsed, it exits your mouth before your body has the chance to disagree, and the world accepts it. They nod, they move on, because I'm fine is a closed door, a gentle way of saying, don't look too closely, don't ask again. But inside, you are unraveling, not dramatically, quietly. You are breaking in ways that don't make noise. You keep appointments, you answer emails, you laugh at the right cues, and no one suspects that your soul is holding its breath. Because anguish, when it's taught to be polite, learns how to dress up as grace. It straightens its posture. It says, please and thank you. It keeps tissues in its pocket, just in case. It lives beneath the surface, pressurized, polite, aching without language. And every time you say, I'm fine, you bury it a little deeper, not because you want to lie, but because you don't know if anyone would hold you without flinching if you told the truth. Because when you've been strong for too long, even asking for help feels like betrayal of the version of yourself you taught everyone to love. So you stay composed, you stay functioning, you stay okay. But your body keeps the score. Your sleep unravels, your appetite flickers. You forget simple things because your mind is using all its power to stay hidden. You smile, but it strains, and still no one notices because they see what you show, and you're good at showing what protects you. But there comes a moment, quiet, unguarded, when the mask slips. Someone asks, are you sure you're okay? And the way they say it is different. Not probing, not impatient, just present. And something inside you stutters. Not because you're ready to break, but because you're ready. to stop pretending you never needed to. And maybe you still say, "I'm fine." But this time, your voice trembles, your eyes soften, your chest exhales a little slower. Because even when the words don't change, the truth begins to leak through. And in that leak, there is a kind of healing, not explosive, not cinematic, but real. You begin to rewrite "I'm fine" into something else, into "I'm managing, but it's heavy." "I don't know what I feel, but I want to find out." "I'm tired of being strong all the time." And the world, if you're lucky, or if you're brave, meets you there, with stillness, with listening, with hands that don't rush to fix you, just hold space until you remember you never had to disappear to deserve care. You start to notice how often you filter yourself to stay digestible, how often you smile through sentences that taste like splinters. You've become fluent in editing, skilled at shrinking the truth, just enough to keep the peace. But peace is not silence. Peace is not pretending. You're unaffected. You begin to feel the tension between the mask and your mouth, how it tightens when you lie kindly, and maybe you don't want to take it off all at once. Maybe it's stitched too tightly, threaded into places you once believed were safety, so you loosen it slowly, one thread at a time. You start saying things like, "I don't know how to talk about it yet." "I'm not fine, but I don't want to be fixed. Can we just sit in the quiet for a while?" And these become new doorways, not wide open, but unlocked. You give people a choice, to enter gently or wait at the edge, and some won't know how. That's okay. You're not asking everyone to see you, only the ones who stay when the brightness dims. Because the truth is, your anguish doesn't need solving. It needs presence, witness, a quiet room where nothing is demanded but breath. And in that room, you finally let yourself feel, without apology. You learn that pain doesn't need to be loud to be heard. You learn that love can arrive even when your smile doesn't. And one day you'll say, "I'm fine," and mean it. Not because you buried your ache, but because you finally stopped hiding it. Because you spoke it, felt it, shared it, and survived. And in that survival, there is a softness stronger than strength, a truth gentler than silence, a you more whole than ever before. You remember it all, but not how you're supposed to. You laugh at the moment you lost something. You cry when you remember the joy. There's no clean order to it, no symmetry, just flashes, sensations, a sudden ache in the middle of a good day, with no clear cause. You look at a photo and feel distant. You hear a song, and you're 12 again, terrified, though nothing bad had happened yet. Your memories are not arranged like books on a shelf. They are more like stars, constellations drawn by feeling, not fact. You reach for one and find another hidden underneath. You pull at a thread, and the whole pattern changes. People ask, "Why are you upset about this now? Didn't that happen years ago?" But memory doesn't run on clocks. It runs on thresholds, on smells, on the way the light falls, through a room that looks just close enough to that other room. It waits in silence. then floods you when you're least prepared, not to harm you, but because it was never finished. You didn't forget, you just paused. You moved forward, with pieces still trailing behind, and now they're catching up. The birthday that felt empty, the goodbye that never fully landed. The moment you realized you were alone, long before you admitted it out loud. They arrive, not when you're ready, but when you're finally still enough to notice they never left. You want to organize them, to place them in boxes labeled then and now, but they won't stay put, because emotion never truly belonged to the moment it appeared in. It belonged to the parts of you that had no language at the time, and now you have the language. Now the past finds a voice through present breath. Now the grief you skipped writes its way into laughter. Now the love you didn't recognize returns in the shape of an ache you can't quite place. It's disorienting. To feel joy about something long gone, to feel fear when nothing's wrong, to feel everything out of order. But what if healing doesn't happen chronologically? What if your heart unfolds in a spiral instead of a line? What if memory returns, not to remind you of who you were, but to reveal who you're still becoming? You do not need to arrange it. You do not need to make it make sense. You only need to welcome it, to feel it as it arrives, even if it makes no narrative sense, even if it contradicts itself. Because memory is not a fact. It is a presence. It is the body saying, "This mattered. This shaped us. We are not finished with this yet." And when you listen, without editing, without judgment, you find coherence in the chaos, not clarity, but compassion, not logic, but connection. And that is enough, because some memories don't need to be understood. They only need to be felt in the moment they finally come home. Some memories return as sound, a voice you haven't heard in years, echoing from somewhere inside your own. Others return as silence dash, a blank spot in a story that used to feel so full. You remember something you thought you'd buried, but this time you don't flinch, you don't brace, you let it rise without needing it to prove anything, because now you no longer treat your past like a courtroom. You don't cross-examine each detail. You don't question your reaction. You don't need to know if the facts still hold up. You just listen, and when you do, something softens. The memory loses its sharpness, not because it fades, but because it's finally seen, without the lens of denial or performance. You realize that your memory was never broken, only waiting for you to stop editing it to fit someone else's version of events. You begin to let your younger self feel what they couldn't feel then. You begin to cry for the kid who laughed too soon. You begin to smile for the teen who looked strong but was crumbling inside. You begin to hold each version of yourself without needing to fix them, and the timeline rearranges itself. You are not haunted. You are accompanied by echoes, by lessons, by fragments that no longer demand resolution, only reverence. This isn't forgetting, it's remembering differently, not through pain, but through presence, not through narrative, but through nearness. And slowly you stop asking, Why am I feeling this now? You start saying, of course I am. Because this is what healing looks like, when it doesn't need to be tidy. A mosaic of feeling, where time folds in on itself and you become whole. Not by linear progress, but by loving every misplaced piece as if it arrived right on time. It didn't look like anger, not at first. It looked like control, like silence, like clenched teeth behind a practiced smile. It looked like being mature for your age, like learning early when not to speak, like walking on glass, but never asking why the floor was sharp. It didn't explode. It endured. It held you up. When love fell through, it braced you. When apology never came, it stood between you and the part of you that still hoped. This rage wasn't chaos. It was architecture. It built boundaries. When no one taught you how, it guarded the soft places. Before you even had words for softness, you didn't know it was rage. You called it independence. You called it resilience. You called it just how I am. But beneath the names was fire, not out of control, not wild, just quiet. Constant, unyielding. It lived in your chest like a coiled wire, not striking but ready, not because you wanted to hurt anyone, but because you had been hurt, and no one noticed. So rage noticed for you. It said, I will not let this happen again. And it didn't. It kept you safe. It kept you sharp. It kept you distant. And maybe that was the cost. Because rage, when it's been wearing armor too long, forgets how to be touched. It forgets how to soften without shattering. It forgets that protection is not the same as peace. And now, you're tired, not of being angry, but of carrying it alone, of holding the line. When the battle ended, years ago, you begin to wonder, is there a version of me beyond this fire, a self, not built in response to harm? You don't want to extinguish the rage. You want to thank it, and then retire it. Let it rest. Let it curl up beside you, instead of standing between you. And every open door, you touch the part of you that once shouted in silence. You say, I hear you now. I'm safe enough to feel something else. And it doesn't go away. It just steps aside. It makes room for grief, for softness, for joy. That doesn't need to be earned. Through resistance, you're not becoming weaker. You're becoming whole. Because even rage, when no longer needed, longs to be held. You used to feel guilty for your anger, guilty that it flared, in quiet moments that it lingered, long after the danger passed. But now you see, it wasn't a flaw, it was a language, the only one your body knew, when it wasn't allowed. To be scared. Anger taught you boundaries before anyone else did. It carved out space. When all you'd known was intrusion, it was the guardian. Who stood watch when vulnerability was too tender to stand on its own? So no, you don't need to reject it. You only need to reassign it. You say, thank you for protecting me. You don't have to do it alone anymore. And your voice doesn't shake when you say it. Because now you are building a self, not from fire, but from freedom. You start learning how to speak without bracing, how to cry without apology, how to love, without defense, and it's terrifying. But it's real. Because when rage softens what's left, isn't weakness, it's truth. You are still fierce, still sharp, still made of everything you've survived. But now, you choose when to burn. You choose what to protect. And sometimes, you choose to open. The gates rage once sealed shut, and when you do, you find something waiting. Not danger, not betrayal, but breath and space and a life, not built entirely in response to pain. You carry the fire still, but now you walk beside it, and together you keep warm. It looked like courage. It looked like calm. You held your head high. You answered kindly. You didn't flinch. People said, "You're so strong." "I don't know how you do it." And you nodded, because what else could you do? They didn't see that what they called strength was just sadness with its back straight, that every composed breath was a negotiation, that every smile was the echo of a tear. You didn't let fall. You didn't want praise. You wanted permission. To collapse, maybe, or to scream, or just once to say, "I'm not okay," and have someone believe you without needing proof. But strength became a role. You played too well, so you stayed upright, even when you were empty, even when you were aching, because weakness felt dangerous, because vulnerability had once cost you more than silence ever did. And so your sadness learned how to wear armor. It learned to answer emails, to show up early, to make jokes in hospital rooms, to be the stable one when everyone else was falling apart. But inside, you were carrying oceans, and no one noticed because you didn't let them, because letting them would mean risking unraveling in front of someone who might not know how to hold what you've been holding alone. So sadness became strategy. It became the scaffolding you built yourself into, and it worked until it didn't, until the strong version of you stopped feeling real, stopped feeling like home, stopped feeling like anything but restraint. And that's when you realized strength is not the same as survival. Survival holds on. Strength knows when to let go. So now you begin to unfasten the mask, slowly, with trembling fingers. You let yourself feel the thing you've been calling fine. You let it speak, not in screams, but in sighs, not in collapse, but in confession. You say, "This hurts. I don't want to carry this alone." And something shifts, not in the world, but in you. The weight doesn't leave, but you stop confusing it with who you are. You stop performing grace. When grief is what's true, you stop calling your silence a virtue. And in that honesty, there is space for someone to see you as you are, not as you've learned to appear. And if they stay, they stay. But more importantly, so do you. You stay with yourself, not as a pillar, not as a hero, but as a human. And that, finally, is the kind of strength that heals. You begin to remember the first time you were called strong and realized it meant you look like you're not falling apart. It felt like a compliment, but landed like a command. So you learned to carry pain, quietly, efficiently, elegantly even, as if making grief beautiful made it hurt less. But beauty doesn't dull it, it only hides it better. And now you're tired of looking composed, when what you really want is to fall softly into someone else's hands, or your own. You don't want to be the one everyone leans on if it means never leaning back. So you start unlearning. You allow yourself to feel messy, inarticulate, out of sync. You allow your sadness to stop dressing up as grace. You stop ironing your voice before speaking. You stop folding your emotions into tidy sentences. You say what's raw, and some people don't know what to do with it. They flinch. They change the subject. They retreat. Let them. They were loving. Your strength, not you, but others, the rare ones. They stay. They don't try to fix it. They don't call it inspiring. They just sit beside you in the soft collapse. And in that stillness, you feel something sacred. The strength you were looking for was never in how long you could hold it together. It was in knowing you no longer had to. Now you carry your sadness like something you're allowed to keep visible. Not a weakness, not a burden, just a truth. You let it walk beside you without dressing it up, and it walks differently now. No longer disguised, no longer silent. Just yours. Finally named, finally safe. It was there, a flicker, a full breath, a laugh that didn't feel borrowed, a moment of ease. So honest it startled you. And then it stopped. Not because anything went wrong, just a pause, an invisible thread pulling you back before the sentence could finish, before the smile fully unfolded. You looked around, expecting something to break, and when nothing did, you broke instead. Because sometimes joy isn't taken from you. You interrupted yourself, not out of self-sabotage, out of memory. Memory of times when joy arrived, just long enough to teach you how much it hurt to lose it. Memory of moments that bloomed in your chest and then burned on their way out. So now, when joy knocks, you open the door slowly. You ask it questions. You check the time. You wonder, is this real? Is this safe? Do I deserve this? You've learned to expect joy as foreshadowing, a prelude to grief, a trap with soft music. So when it begins, you listen for the ending, even when there isn't one, even when this joy is whole, honest, untethered to pain. But your body doesn't know that yet. Your nervous system flinches, you smile, and your breath holds itself hostage. Because this joy feels unearned, like walking into a room you weren't invited to, but deeply needed to see. And here's the truth. You don't trust joy, because no one ever taught you how to stay with it. They taught you how to recover, how to rise, how to rebuild, but no one taught you how to rest inside a moment that asks nothing but to be felt. So now, you practice, you let the joy come back, even in fragments, even unfinished. You speak the sentence, even if your voice shakes. You let the laugh arrive, without explaining it away. You hold the light, without asking what it will cost. And it's terrifying, because joy uninterrupted feels too vulnerable, like standing still in a world that never stops bracing. But you stand anyway. You say, I know this may not last, but it's here now, and I am here now. And that is the beginning of joy becoming home instead of warning, a sentence that finishes, a moment that lingers, a feeling that stays. You begin to notice the moments you cut short, the compliment you deflect, the invitation you almost accept, the joy you touch, then quickly place back, like something too fragile to belong to you. But slowly, you stop retreating from it. You stop asking joy to justify itself. You let it stay just a little longer, even when it feels unfamiliar, especially then, because this joy, it's not loud. It doesn't demand attention. It hums. It flickers. It waits to be trusted. And you are learning to feel good without apology, learning to feel good without the shadow of what if. You realize that joy is not a trick, not a prelude to punishment, not a mistake. It's a part of you that got quiet after being interrupted too many times. Now you invite it to speak again, to finish its sentence, even if it stutters, even if it's short, even if it ends with silence instead of punctuation. You learn to listen without flinching. You learn to feel without bracing. And one day, you won't just let joy in. You'll welcome it without wondering when it plans to leave, and it will stay, because it was never here, to betray you, only to remind you that you are not broken for needing to learn how to feel good again. It hovered, not pain, not joy, not longing exactly, just something, on the verge of becoming, a sensation with no center, a sentence you never finished, a glance you never returned. You felt it, like a shadow behind your breath. Not heavy, just present. It lived in the space between what you wanted and what you allowed, what you noticed and what you ignored. It showed up in the smallest moments, the almost tear, the half smile, the quiet ache when someone says your name and you forget how to feel about it. This wasn't repression, it was delay. An emotion paused in transit, delivered to the wrong address, then forgotten on the porch. Of your awareness, you look back, trying to trace it, but all you find are outlines, scattered hints, a dream that faded before the plot arrived. And still, it echoes, not to haunt you, but to remind you that not every feeling arrives fully formed. Some enter as fog, as pulse, as memory with no image. You tried to name it once. You gave it other people's words. You wrapped it in metaphors. That didn't quite fit, but it stayed wild, wordless, waiting for you to stop defining it and simply let it be. So now, you let it echo, not to solve it, not to find its origin, just to listen. And in listening, you realize something rare. This feeling wasn't unfinished because it was weak. It was unfinished because it was honest, because it never needed to become anything more than what it already was. A presence, a whisper, a moment. That almost meant everything. And maybe it still does, not in its sharpness, but in its softness, not in its clarity, but in its rhythm. An echo, not of what was said, but of what was real, before words arrived. You carry it now, not to resolve, but to remember. That even the almost feelings, the near emotions, the quiet unknowns, are worthy of being held. They, too, were part of you, and still are. You stop asking what it was. You stop trying to catch it. Like a thought fleeing your grasp, you let it live, as vibration, as atmosphere, as the color that bled just outside the lines, because not all feelings are meant to arrive. As headlines, some are weather, some are shadow, some are the shape your heart takes when no one's watching. And maybe this one, this echo dash, was never supposed to be resolved. Maybe it came, not to be explained, but to accompany, like a wordless companion, on the days your emotions are too quiet to speak in full. You begin to treat it gently. You no longer demand it evolve. You no longer require it to sharpen into pain or bloom into clarity. You let it hover, like breath, like scent, like a note held just slightly off key, but still part of the song. And in that it finds a resting place inside you, not as confusion, but as truth. That never needed a form. To be real, you look back now, not to decipher, but to witness the hug you almost gave, the love you didn't confess, the anger you softened into silence, the joy that blinked, then vanished. They all echo, not as regret, but as evidence that you lived, that you felt, even if the feeling never landed, even if it trembled too softly. To be named. You realize now, wholeness is not having every feeling fully formed. It's allowing even the half-born ones to belong, to stay, to hum in the background, like an unfinished melody. That needs no ending, to be beautiful. And so you listen to the echo. And for once, you don't try to answer it. You simply let it ring,